In 2025, the Ohio Supreme Court made its final decision on a case that had already shaken the community to its core. The justices declined to hear the appeal of McKenzie Shirilla, the Strongsville teenager convicted of murdering her boyfriend and his friend by intentionally crashing her car into a warehouse wall at nearly 100 miles per hour. That decision left the conviction intact and confirmed the ruling of two lower courts. McKenzie, now 20 years old, will not be eligible for parole until October 29, 2037. She is currently serving a 15 years to life sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, identified in state records as inmate W111780. The appellate judges had called the evidence overwhelming. Investigators, prosecutors, and a community had spent more than a year proving that what happened in the early hours of July 31st, 2022, was not a tragic accident. It was deliberate. The crash occurred at 5:30 a.m. on Progress Drive, a dead-end industrial road in Strongsville, Ohio. The scene that officers found there was catastrophic. A Toyota Camry had gone straight through the end of the road and into the brick wall of a warehouse. The front of the vehicle was completely destroyed. Glass, debris, and car parts were scattered across the pavement. Inside were three people. Dominic Russo, age 20, front passenger. Davion Flanagan, age 19, rear passenger. McKenzie Shirilla, age 17, the driver. Russo and Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene. Shirilla was found alive, trapped upside down in the driver's seat with serious injuries. She was airlifted to Metro Health Medical Center in critical condition. At first, Strongsville police treated it as a severe traffic accident. There were no immediate signs of impairment, no other vehicles involved, and no skid marks indicating braking. But when investigators began analyzing the evidence, what they found would change the course of the case entirely. The car's event data recorder, often referred to as the black box, showed that in the final seconds before impact, the accelerator was pressed to the floor. There was no application of the brake pedal. Speed reached approximately 100 miles per hour in a zone where the limit was 25. The steering pattern showed that the car had made a controlled swerve to avoid a tree before realigning directly toward the wall. This was not a loss of control. It was a deliberate trajectory. Strongsville police began a full criminal investigation. They consulted with the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, which ordered a full mechanical inspection and digital analysis of the vehicle. Both confirmed the same result. No brake input, full acceleration, no malfunction. Security footage obtained from a nearby business captured the crash itself. The video, played later in court, showed headlights racing down Progress Drive, the car moving in a straight line until it disappeared in a burst of debris against the wall. Investigators described it as consistent with intentional acceleration. By November 4th, 2022, prosecutors had gathered enough evidence to charge McKenzie Shirilla as an adult. She was indicted on 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. Her attorney argued that the crash was the result of a medical episode, specifically a fainting condition known as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, POTS. Prosecutors countered with digital data, physical evidence, and driving history that they said proved intent. Investigators also documented that Shirilla had previously driven on Progress Drive several times before the crash, often alone, following the same route. Those prior drives, combined with the black box data and video evidence, became key components of the prosecution's argument that she had planned the act. The case went to trial in July 2023 at the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court before Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. Shirilla waived her right to a jury, meaning the verdict would be decided solely by the judge after reviewing all evidence. Over multiple days, prosecutors presented the data recorder readings, surveillance footage, photographs of the crash scene, and testimony from crash reconstruction experts. They emphasized that Shirilla was the only person in the car wearing a seatbelt, a fact that likely saved her life. The defense argued that her injuries and lack of memory made it impossible for her to have acted with intent. They maintained that the crash was a tragic accident caused by a sudden loss of consciousness. On August 14, 2023, after reviewing the evidence, Judge Russo delivered her verdict. She found McKenzie Shirilla guilty on all counts, describing her actions as intentional, deliberate, and controlled. In the ruling, the judge stated, "This was not reckless driving. This was murder. The mission was death." A week later, on August 21st, 2023, Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, with all counts running concurrently. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read. Dominic Russo's mother, Christine Russo, spoke through tears, telling reporters afterward that no punishment could ever bring her son back. Following her conviction, Shirilla's legal team filed an appeal with the 8th District Court of Appeals. On September 26, 2024, the appellate court upheld the conviction, finding that the trial judge had not erred in weighing the evidence. The appellate decision reaffirmed that the data recorder, surveillance footage, and driving history supported the conclusion of intent. Shirilla's attorneys then appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, seeking a discretionary review. On April 30th, 2025, the court declined to hear the case, effectively ending the appeals process. As of October 2025, McKenzie Shirilla remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction lists her parole eligibility as October 29, 2037. Strongsville still remembers that morning, the sound of the crash, the lives lost, and the wall that now stands as a permanent reminder. 2 families continue to grieve, 1 family continues to defend, and the community still drives slower when they pass Progress Drive. The crash that once looked like a tragic accident has since been proven, in court and on record, to be a double homicide carried out behind the wheel. And with every appeal denied, the conclusion remains the same. McKenzie Shirilla intentionally caused the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. On November 4th, 2022, police arrived at a quiet home in Strongsville, Ohio, with a warrant in hand. The girl they'd once called a miracle survivor was now being arrested for murder. 18-year-old McKenzie F. Shirilla was taken into custody and charged as an adult for the crash that killed Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan 3 months earlier. The indictment listed 12 counts in total. For count of murder, for count of felonious assault, 2 count of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. Prosecutors alleged that what had been called a tragedy was, in fact, an intentional act. The same girl who'd been pulled alive from a crushed Toyota Camry was now accused of deliberately driving it into a warehouse wall at nearly 100 miles an hour. The news divided the town. In August, McKenzie had been seen as a lone survivor of an awful accident. By November, she was being called a killer. Friends deleted old tributes. Some still defended her online. Others didn't know what to think. Behind the scenes, investigators had spent months building a timeline that made the charges possible. The vehicle's event data recorder, the black box, showed that in the final seconds before impact, the accelerator was fully pressed while the brake was never touched. Speed, top 100 miles per hour. A warehouse security camera captured the car heading straight down Progress Drive. Lights fixed, never slowing, never swerving. Then came data from her phone. Location records showed that in the weeks before the crash, McKenzie had driven that same road multiple times alone, always turning around at the dead end. Investigators believed she had rehearsed a path she would later take with Dominic and Davion in the car. Her defense attorney, James McDonald, denied that narrative entirely. He said McKenzie was sick, not violent. She had been diagnosed with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, a condition that can cause fainting and dizziness. The defense argued she might have lost consciousness that morning. The lack of braking, they said, could have been the result of her body giving out, not a deliberate choice. They asked the court to see her as a teenager who had suffered enough, a girl who had nearly died herself. Prosecutors countered that every piece of evidence pointed control, not chaos. The steering had been exact. The car had even veered around a tree seconds before impact, as if the driver had wanted to ensure nothing stopped the crash. The path was straight. The speed was constant. There was no sign of a medical emergency. As both sides prepared for trial, the families of Dominic and Davion attended every hearing. Dominic's mother, Christine Russo, said she'd warned her son about the relationship months earlier, worried about its volatility. Now she sat in court clutching photos of him, waiting for answers. On the opposite side, Mackenzie's parents watched in disbelief as prosecutors described her daughter's actions in terms they could hardly recognize. When the case finally reached the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court in July 2023, McKenzie made a choice that surprised everyone. She waived her right to a jury. Her fate would rest solely in the hands of Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. In the quiet of that courtroom, there would be no appeals to emotion, no tears to sway 12 strangers, only evidence. The prosecution opened by laying out the data, the black box, the video footage, the driving history. They said McKenzie had driven that same road 7 times before. They said she was the only person in the car wearing a seatbelt. They said she had full control. They called it an execution. The defense held firm that it was an accident, a tragic result of medical condition and a momentary blackout. For days, the judge listened as experts reconstructed the crash second by second. They testified that no mechanical failures had been found, that the acceleration and steering pattern were consistent with deliberate input. The evidence, they said, did not support the claim of unconsciousness. McKenzie remained quiet through it all. Her legs still carried the scars of crash. She listened as witnesses described the sound of the impact, the stillness that followed, the footage of the headlights slicing down the empty street. Each replay was as stark as the first. No brakes, no turn, just a straight line into the wall. On August 14th, 2023, Judge Russo delivered her verdict. The courtroom stood silent as she read her statement. This was not reckless driving, she said. This was murder. The mission was death. With those words, McKenzie Shirilla was found guilty on all counts. The judge concluded that her conduct before, during, and after the crash showed intent beyond reasonable doubt. 1 week later, on August 21st, the sentence was handed down. 15 years to life in prison. The counts would run concurrently. It was the minimum penalty for murder in Ohio, but the meaning was clear. McKenzie would not be eligible for parole until 2037, when she turned 31. Dominic's mother wept as the decision was read. She told reporters outside the courthouse that nothing could bring her son back, but at least the truth had been acknowledged. It's something, she said quietly. The courtroom emptied, but Strongsville didn't move on. The crash that had started as a tragedy was now written in court records as a double homicide. The girl once treated as a survivor was a convicted murderer. The warehouse walls still bore the scars of the impact, a silent witness to a case that had stripped away every illusion of accident. McKenzie was transferred to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, where she remains today. The trial had lasted weeks, but its shadow stretched across the town that raised her. For some, it was justice. For others, disbelief. But no one in Strongsville forgot what the data had proven, what the footage had shown, or what the judge had said. The mission was death, and now the consequence was life. Every murder case leaves a trail, but in this one, the trail wasn't made of fingerprints or DNA. It was made of data. The car's computer, the surveillance footage, the phone records. They told the story no one else could. Together, they turned a crash scene into a blueprint of intent. When investigators first pulled the data from McKenzie Shirilla's Toyota Camry, the readings looked mechanical, emotionless. Lines of code and numbers that captured the final seconds of 3 young lives. But those numbers told detectives something that no survivor had. They showed that the gas pedal had been pressed all the way down, 100% throttle, for over 5 seconds before the car hit the wall. The speed had risen past 100 miles per hour. There was no indication of braking. Crash reconstruction experts testified that such data was consistent with deliberate acceleration. The steering column readings confirmed small, calculated movements. The car avoided a tree seconds before impact and straightened just before hitting the warehouse wall. For investigators, that precision ruled out panic or medical distress. Then came the footage. A warehouse security camera, mounted on the side of a nearby logistics building, had captured what no one had seen in person. The timestamp read just after 5 in the morning. Headlights appear at the far end of the street, gaining speed. The car races down Progress Drive, a dead-end road lined with offices and storage units, until it vanishes in a white burst of debris. The video was silent, but jurors didn't need sound. The motion spoke for itself. The car never slowed. Detectives compared the footage with the vehicle data and found they matched perfectly. Acceleration to the end, impact dead center. What they were looking at wasn't a loss of control. It was a controlled collision. But the most critical evidence didn't come from machines. It came from McKenzie's own phone. Investigators obtained a search warrant for her digital records. GPS history showed that in the weeks before the crash, she had taken the same route down Progress Drive multiple times. Always alone, always late at night, always stopping just short of the wall. These drives occurred on at least 7 different dates. To prosecutors, this pattern was not coincidence. It was premeditation. Crash reconstruction specialists explained that the consistency of these trips suggested she was familiar with the road's layout, the curve, the distance of the wall, and the exact line required to hit it straight on. The prosecutor later described it as practice runs. Defense attorneys challenged that interpretation, arguing the trips could have been random or social visits, but they offered no evidence of another destination. Progress Drive was not a residential area. It led only to warehouses and a brick barrier. When combined with the black box and surveillance video, the GPS data created a timeline that prosecutors said was impossible to ignore. It showed a series of deliberate choices, driving to the same place repeatedly, learning its end, and returning one final time with passengers in the car. Investigators also examined the seatbelt usage. In the wreckage, McKenzie was found restrained. Dominic and Davion were not. It was a small detail, but to detectives it carried weight. If the crash was spontaneous, how is it that only the driver, the one person responsible for the car's movement, had fastened her belt? Experts later confirmed that the seatbelt's locking mechanism had functioned perfectly. Forensic analysts ruled out mechanical failure, tire blowout, and steering malfunction. Toxicology reports came back negative for alcohol or major narcotics. There was no evidence that McKenzie had been impaired. Everything pointed instead to deliberate action. In the trial, prosecutors presented the full chain of evidence in chronological order. They began with the black box, followed by the footage, then the GPS records. By the time they finished, the technical narrative had become unmistakable. The crash wasn't random, and it wasn't accidental. It was planned and executed with precision. The defense attempted to create doubt through medical explanation. They reiterated that McKenzie suffered from postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, a condition that can cause dizziness or fainting. They said that her lack of memory of the crash was consistent with trauma, and that losing consciousness could have caused her to accelerate without realizing it. Judge Nancy Russo considered the argument carefully, but the steering corrections before impact contradicted it. A person who had fainted would not have swerved around a tree or aligned the car directly with a wall. The judge noted that the path was too straight, the control too deliberate. There was also the question of speed. Investigators testified that the car's acceleration increased steadily until impact, meaning pressure on the gas pedal had been consistent. Had she blacked out, the car's speed would have fluctuated as her foot slackened. It hadn't. Each piece of evidence supported the other. Data confirming the video confirming the GPS confirming the pattern. It was a case built on digital truth. During closing arguments, prosecutors told the court that technology had become the silent witness to a crime no one lived to describe. The machines had recorded what really happened when human memory could not. When Judge Russo read her verdict, she cited these digital records as the cornerstone of her decision. She said the evidence established beyond a reasonable doubt that McKenzie had acted with purpose. In her words, this was not reckless driving. This was murder. After the trial, legal analysts called the case a landmark example of how forensic technology can determine intent in vehicular homicide. The black box, phone records, and surveillance footage replaced traditional eyewitness testimony. The data didn't speculate. It documented. For Dominic and Davion's families, those records were both a comfort and a torment. They proved what happened, but also erased any illusion that their deaths were accidental. The wall on Progress Drive wasn't just struck by chance. It had been chosen. By the time the verdict was entered, there were no mysteries left to solve. Every second had been measured, every mile traced, every input recorded. The evidence had done what no confession ever could. It told the story, without hesitation, of how a moment of acceleration became murder. When the verdict came down on August 14th, 2023, the courtroom in downtown Cleveland fell completely silent. Every seat was filled. Family members, reporters, officers who had worked the case since day one. They all stood waiting as Judge Nancy Margaret Russo looked up from a file that held nearly a year of investigation, testimony, and digital proof. Her words were deliberate. "This was not reckless driving," she said. "This was murder. The mission was death." With that statement, 17-year-old McKenzie Shirilla, now legally an adult, was convicted on all counts of the crash that killed Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The evidence, the judge ruled, had shown a pattern of intent from start to finish. The decision was final. There had been no jury to sway, no crowd to influence. McKenzie had waived that right weeks earlier, placing her fate solely in the hands of a judge. What followed was not celebration, but grief. Dominic's and Davion's families wept quietly in the courtroom. Some had attended every hearing, sitting through the same footage of the crash over and over, watching the same few seconds of light and destruction that ended 2 young lives. For Judge Russo, the case was unlike any she had presided over in decades. Vehicular homicides were tragically common. Intentional vehicular murder was not. The decision to find intent in a car crash was grounded not in emotion, but in the data, the black box, the steering records, the GPS logs. The evidence, she said, left no room for doubt. The sentencing took place a week later, on August 21st, 2023. The same courtroom that had sat in shock now filled again with the same faces, this time waiting for a number. How many years would McKenzie serve before she could ever walk free? The prosecution recommended the standard penalty for murder in Ohio, 15 years to life in prison. The defense argued for leniency, citing her age and her medical condition. They asked the court to consider the possibility of rehabilitation. When McKenzie entered the courtroom, she was wearing the same black ankle brace she had worn throughout the trial, a lingering reminder of the injury she sustained in the crash. She said nothing as she stood before the judge. Judge Russo read from her notes, emphasizing that the sentence was guided by law, not emotion. She said the court had considered McKenzie's youth, but also her deliberate choices. The result was clear. 15 years to life, all counts to run concurrently. The earliest she could be considered for parole would be October 29th, 2037, when she would be 31 years old. As the judge spoke, Dominic Russo's mother, Christine Russo, began to cry. She had been in the courtroom every day of the trial. After the sentencing, she told reporters that the punishment brought some measure of peace, but not closure. "It will never be enough," she said softly outside the courthouse. "But it's something." The prosecutor, Michael O'Malley, released a statement following the sentencing. He called the crash an act of murder driven by obsession and control. He thanked the Strongsville Police Department for a meticulous investigation and said that the verdict proved that the truth can be found even in silence, even when no witnesses remain. That silence lingered long after the courtroom emptied. The footage of the crash, the headlights, the impact, the stillness, had been replayed hundreds of times during the proceedings. But for the families who lived through it, those few seconds would never stop. Following the sentencing, McKenzie was transferred from the Cuyahoga County Jail to the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, roughly 2 hours south of Cleveland. State prison records list her as inmate W111780, with a life term and parole eligibility in 2037. For the first time since the crash, she was no longer under her parents' care or hospital supervision. The girl who had once been airlifted from the wreckage now entered the same system as any other convicted murderer. Her lawyers filed a notice of appeal within weeks, challenging both the verdict and the judge's interpretation of intent. They argued that the evidence could support recklessness, but not premeditation. The prosecution countered that every drive, every second of acceleration, and every steering correction proved otherwise. The appeals process would stretch into 2024, but at that moment in August, the case of State of Ohio v. McKenzie F. Shirilla had reached its first legal ending. Outside the courthouse, news cameras caught a striking contrast. On one side of the steps stood Dominic's and Davion's families, arms around one another, tears mixed with relief. On the other side, Mackenzie's parents held each other and refused interviews. They had maintained throughout that their daughter was incapable of murder. Now, the court's decision said otherwise. Across Ohio, the story spread fast. The footage of the crash, the details of the investigation, the judge's words, the mission was death, appeared in headlines from Cleveland to Cincinnati. For many, it was the first time they'd heard of a murder conviction secured through black box data. The legal significance of the case reached far beyond Strongsville. Experts pointed out that it demonstrated how technology could establish intent in crimes where traditional evidence was missing. It was, as one analyst put, a case solved by machines. But for the families, the importance wasn't legal. It was personal. 2 young men were gone. Their names, Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, became synonymous with a tragedy that reshaped their hometown. Progress Drive, once just another industrial road, was now a place people avoided. The marks on the wall where the Camry hit remained visible months later, a faint imprint of metal and memory. After the verdict, a memorial plaque was placed near the site, surrounded by flowers that strangers still leave each year. On the anniversary of the crash, people gather quietly, light candles, and stand in the same silence that once surrounded the wreck. Inside prison walls, McKenzie began serving her sentence under standard security. Public records confirm that she remains incarcerated with no disciplinary issues recorded as of 2025. Her projected parole review remains unchanged. The trial ended, but the echoes of it didn't. The data that proved intent, the judge's words, and the grief of 2 families became part of Ohio's legal history. In Strongsville, people still slow down when they drive past Progress Drive, not out of fear of the law, but out of respect for what happened there. The question that once divided the town, accident or murder, had been answered. The evidence had spoken. The court had ruled, and the sentence had been served. For Dominic and Davion's families, justice had a number: 15 years to life. For McKenzie Shirilla, justice had a date: October 29th, 2037. And for everyone else, it had a memory that would never fade: the soundless flash of a car hitting a wall and the silence that came after. The verdict was not the end of the story. In criminal law, it rarely is. Within weeks of her sentencing, McKenzie F., Shirilla's legal team filed a formal appeal to the 8th District Court of Appeals in Cuyahoga County, arguing that her murder conviction was unjustified. The appeal, recorded as Case No. CA 23-113167, will become the next major phase of a case already cemented in Ohio's history. The appeal wasn't about denying the crash or its devastation. It was about intent. The defense argued that while McKenzie's driving had been reckless and tragic, it didn't meet the legal threshold for purposeful killing. They asked the appellate court to re-examine the evidence, contending that the judge had improperly interpreted data as proof of premeditation. Their position was that the crash, no matter how horrific, could not be proven to be deliberate beyond reasonable doubt. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office responded quickly. Their counterargument was built on the same foundation that had secured conviction: black box data, video surveillance, and repeated prior trips to the crash site. They emphasized that McKenzie's actions before and during the collision were consistent with intent, and that the trial judge's decision had been legally sound. On September 26, 2024, the 8th District Court of Appeals issued its ruling. The conviction stood. The 3-judge panel unanimously upheld both the verdict and the sentence. In their written opinion, the court stated that the evidence presented at trial overwhelmingly established that the defendant acted with purpose. The judges highlighted the data from the vehicle's event recorder and McKenzie's driving history as substantial proof of deliberate conduct. For McKenzie's legal team, it was a devastating blow. The appeals court had not only reaffirmed the verdict, it had endorsed every major finding of the original trial. The decision closed the door on any possibility of immediate relief. But one door remained: Ohio's highest court. Her attorneys filed a notice of appeal to the Ohio Supreme Court, requesting discretionary review. Their petition argued that the appellate decision had expanded the definition of intent in a way that could set a new precedent for vehicular cases statewide. They contended that if acceleration data alone could define intent, then future defendants could face murder charges for crashes without confessions, witnesses, or traditional evidence. The Supreme Court reviewed the petition in early 2025. On April 30th, 2025, the court issued its decision. In a brief entry, typical of cases not accepted for review, the justices declined jurisdiction, stating simply that the appeal did not meet the criteria for consideration. With that one-sentence ruling, McKenzie Shirilla's conviction became final. No further state-level appeals were available. Unless new evidence emerged, the next time her name would appear in a courtroom would be for a parole hearing, 12 years in the future. After the Ohio Supreme Court's decision, public attention on the case began to fade, but inside the state prison system, her life had just begun a new, quieter chapter. Records from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, ODRC, list her current location as the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, the state's largest facility for female inmates. Her inmate identification number is W111780. The ODRC database confirms her conviction for murder, with a sentence of 15 years to life and a parole eligibility date of October 29, 2037. Prison intake records show that McKenzie entered the facility in late 2023, a few months after sentencing. Like all new inmates, she went through medical and psychological evaluations before being placed in the general population. There are no recorded disciplinary issues or public reports of infractions connected to her name. Inmates at Marysville follow a regimented schedule, mandatory work assignments, counseling programs, education opportunities, and recreation periods. The facility is home to offenders serving sentences from a few months to life terms. McKenzie's placement there is standard for long-term female inmates convicted of serious violent crimes. Although the prison does not comment on individual behavior, public databases show that McKenzie is in good standing with no outstanding disciplinary sanctions. Her earliest possible release date remains unchanged. If she serves her full minimum term, she will be 31 years old when first eligible to appear before the Ohio Parole Board. While McKenzie's legal options were closing, her case continued to spark discussions across Ohio. Legal experts debated whether the ruling marked a new chapter in how courts define intent in vehicular deaths. Prosecutors called it a victory for digital forensics. Defense attorneys cautioned that it blurred the line between recklessness and premeditation. In interviews, Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Michael O'Malley said the evidence had left no other logical conclusion. He emphasized that the data-driven nature of the case had made it uniquely strong. Technology doesn't lie, he told local news outlets. When you accelerate at 100 miles per hour and never touch the brake, the truth is right there in the computer. The appellate court's ruling mirrored that sentiment. It cited the data as objective and irrefutable, a kind of witness immune to emotion or interpretation. For the victims' families, the outcome reaffirmed what they had believed from the start. Dominic Russo's mother, Christine Russo, said after the Ohio Supreme Court's refusal to hear the case that she could finally begin to move forward. "We never wanted revenge," she told reporters. "Just the truth. Now the truth is permanent." As of late 2025, McKenzie remains in state custody with no pending motions before any Ohio court. Post-conviction filings are publicly listed but have not resulted in hearings or new evidence. Unless federal appeals are filed, a process that could take years, her path is fixed until 2037. Her family continues to live in Strongsville, rarely speaking publicly. The site of the crash on Progress Drive has been repaired but not forgotten. The warehouse wall bears a lighter shade of brick where it was rebuilt, and small memorials still appear there each July. Flowers, photos, and candles left by friends of Dominic and Davion. The case has since been cited in legal journals and university discussions about the use of digital forensics in criminal intent. In classrooms and conferences, it's referred to as an example of how machines, not eyewitnesses, can prove a state of mind. But inside the prison walls, there are no debates or headlines, only the slow passing of years. McKenzie Shirilla's life now runs on institutional time. counted not in miles per hour, but in minutes until lockup and hours until morning. Her name, once splashed across national headlines, now appears only in state records. The courts have spoken, the evidence remains undisputed, and the sentence endures. Her next appearance before any legal authority won't be for more arguments or appeals. It will be before the Ohio Parole Board more than a decade from now, when the state will decide whether she served enough of her life sentence to walk free again. Until then, the case that once divided Strongsville remains settled in law and remembered in silence. By 2025, Strongsville had moved on, at least on the surface. The warehouse wall on Progress Drive had been repaired, but the memory of that morning never faded. The case of State of Ohio v. McKenzie F. Shirilla had become one of the most talked-about prosecutions in recent Ohio history, a story of technology, tragedy, and a definition of murder rewritten through data. What began as a single car crash evolved into a courtroom precedent. The verdict and subsequent appeals established that intent to kill could be proven through digital evidence alone, black box readings, GPS data, and surveillance footage, even in the absence of eyewitnesses or confession. Legal experts across the state called it one of the first cases in Ohio where forensic data fully replaced human testimony to establish motive and control. Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Michael O'Malley said the case underscored how modern investigations rely on science, not speculation. In interviews following the sentencing, he explained that what once would have been dismissed as a traffic accident had, through technology, revealed deliberate homicide. The evidence spoke for itself, he said. It showed purpose, precision, and choice. Defense attorneys who followed the case saw it differently. Some warned that it expanded the reach of murder law, allowing prosecutors to infer intent from data patterns that might once have been viewed as circumstantial. Criminal law professors at several Ohio universities cited the case in lectures about the future of vehicular homicide, calling it a turning point for digital interpretation in courtrooms. Whatever perspective, the outcome was undeniable. The technology had reconstructed every second of the crash. The acceleration, the steering corrections, the speed, and the final impact. The machine had done what no witness could. It had remembered. Outside the legal system, the story carried a different weight. It became a symbol of loss and warning. Strongsville High School, where all three of the teenagers had once been students, held moment of silence on anniversaries of the crash. A memorial scholarship was established in Dominic Russo's name to support students pursuing careers in automotive safety and engineering, a gesture meant to turn tragedy into prevention. On Progress Drive, the site itself became part of the town's quiet folklore. Drivers slowed when they passed the intersection of Pearl Road and Progress. Warehouse employees said people still came by at night to leave flowers or light candles. For residents, it wasn't superstition. It was remembrance. The families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan continue to speak publicly about accountability. They attended each hearing, each appeal, and every anniversary memorial. In interviews, Dominic's mother, Christine Russo, said that while the verdict brought justice, the pain would never disappear. You learn to live around it, she said, but you never move past it. The Flanagan family shared similar feelings, telling reporters that their son's death had changed their understanding of forgiveness and resilience. Both families expressed gratitude to the investigators who spent months reconstructing the crash. To them, it wasn't about headlines. It was about truth. The broader conversation around the case reached beyond Strongsville. News outlets, law schools, and criminal justice organizations used it as a study in how forensic technology could shape future prosecutions. Legal experts described it as a digital crime scene, one that could be replayed endlessly through code and video, leaving no room for revision or reinterpretation. The 8th District Court of Appeals opinion from September 2024 has since been cited in legal briefs concerning vehicular intent. The decision explicitly stated that the combination of repeated route patterns, black box readings, and absence of braking established a calculated act. That phrase, calculated act, has already begun appearing in Ohio case law discussions, marking the Shirilla case as a reference point for prosecutors statewide. Yet for all its legal importance, the case remains a deeply human story. A 17-year-old girl, 2 young men, a moment of acceleration that changed lives forever. The facts are clear. the verdict final, but the emotions it left behind are still raw. In prison, McKenzie Shirilla now lives a structured routine. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction confirms that she remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women under a life sentence, eligible for parole in 2037. There are no reported disciplinary issues on record. Her name appears in legal databases and case law indexes, but beyond those records, little else is known. Since the Ohio Supreme Court's refusal to hear her appeal in April 2025, there have been no new filings or motions. The case has reached its legal endpoint. What remains is time. 12 more years until the possibility of parole. 12 more years for a community to reflect on the line between tragedy and crime. In Strongsville, that reflection continues quietly. The community that once rallied around 3 victims of crash now remembers 2 of them as sons, friends, and brothers, and the third as a driver who made a fatal choice. The question that once echoed, was it an accident or murder, has been answered in the only way a courtroom can answer, with a verdict and a sentence. Progress Drive stands as it always did, a narrow stretch of asphalt ending in a brick wall. The new bricks are lighter than the old ones, a visible scar that time hasn't yet blended away. At night, when the street is empty, the only sound is a hum of passing traffic from Pearl Road, a reminder of the lives once lost there. Every July, a few candles appear by the curb, a photo, a folded note, sometimes a single white rose. They are small gestures, but they say everything. The legal chapters of State v. Shirilla are closed, but the impact remains in law books, in classrooms, and in the memory of a town that learned how a car's computer could speak louder than any confession. In the end, the story is no longer about the crash itself or the data or the verdict. It's about what those things revealed, that behind every line of code, there is a human choice. And once made, some choices can never be undone.